Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're really excited to see all of you and to talk about our mental health shortage today. So I wanted to give a little context as to why we're hosting this panel. I think one of the things that, obviously we've all been talking about a mental health worker shortage for the last couple of months. But a couple of things this conversation has brought up for us and I should actually introduce myself. I'm Bessie. I'm the executive director for Alternatives. I realized I jumped right into talking, but we were having conversations internally, and the conversation today was inspired by a couple of topics. One is the shortage of mental health workers is not new. We've been experiencing this before the pandemic, particularly in communities of color and trying to hire practitioners of color. The history of barriers in communities of color due to racism have created a lot of trauma in communities of color, and we've been asking for people who represent us. The difference we believe today is that the culmination of the pandemic and the public murder of George Floyd has created more of a collective trauma in which it has heightened awareness for everybody. And with that came a pouring of resources that have left a ton of vacancies because we can't hire at the rate of the need. And there's all these other underlying issues coming up. One of the ones that has come up for us is just how few people of color actually get to this profession. And, personally, I'm Latina, I am an MSW, and, I've been talking a lot with my team about what a challenge it is as a person of color who grew up poor to go through this process of getting into the higher education, being able to afford higher education, a graduate degree, being able to keep up with your studies when you have to do an internship and work, because we can't just not work. And then coming out with student loan debt that 10 years later, I've been consistently paying and owe more today than I did 10 years ago. And these are the experiences of so many practitioners of color. On average, we have a higher debt than white practitioners. And so this conversation about the mental health worker shortage is not just about pay, though that is a part of it. Right now, I just calculated the livable wage for, if you have a family of 4, 2 working adults and 2 kids, livable wage would mean that each adult is earning at least $46,000, right? And now we're talking about clinicians who may carry on more debt, have more credentialing than your average worker, and they're looking for a much higher pay. And the challenges for us to be able to provide that, but also in not providing that, what comes up is how are we complicit in contributing to the wealth gap? How are our structures not keeping up with the needs of our worker? There is an interesting conversation shift today around how this is not a great resignation, but it's a great reshuffling, in that our workers are no longer willing to take some of what they've seen from workforces in the past, and really not wanting to go back into places that commit microaggressions against them, and are not really rooted in practices of equity. And so what I would like, and I know this panel is going to do an amazing job of, is really just talking about all of these impacts from barrier to entry in this into this profession to how we keep up as nonprofits and philanthropy in meeting the needs of our practitioners, but more specifically our practitioners of color. So I'm really excited to introduce everybody who you'll hear from today. And that is Diana Castañeda. She is an LCPC, the Director of Youth and Family Services at Community Counseling Centers of Chicago, C4. Hi Diana. We have Tiffany Patton-Burnside, an LCSW and the Senior Director of Crisis Services at CDPH. And we have Dominique McCord, an LCSW and Director of Behavioral Health Services for the Metropolitan Peace Initiatives of Metropolitan Family Services. And we selected these panelists, one for their amazing expertise. I got a chance to talk to them a couple of weeks ago, and it was great. But also because these conversations should not be happening without us. We reflect the communities that serve. And so I think it's really important to amplify this voice at this time, always, but particularly at this time. And these panelists will be moderated by CDPH, City Department of Public Health, Kathy Calderon. All right, turn it over to you guys.
Trying to get on mute. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for joining this important discussion and panel. I'm especially excited to have this conversation with such wonderful and impactful women in the field who are leaders and who are serving our community of colors, our communities of color, and also practitioners of color every day. And so I'm so excited to hear from all of you and to talk today. And so if you've signed up for this panel, you are aware that there is a workforce shortage of mental health practitioners, and really want to get into what has led to where we are at today, and what are the longer term implications, and how we can work together to really address this issue, especially in the context of such a high need for mental health services. The city of Chicago, we're really working towards increasing mental health equity, looking at areas where there are gaps in mental health services, and also figuring out how do we support providers in being able to address mental health issues in the community. So whether you're logged into Zoom or you're on Facebook Live, please feel free to submit any questions or thoughts as we go, and the alternatives team will be able to help gather questions. And we are excited to also open it up for questions after our panelists talk through some of the discussion points that we have today. So thank you so much for being here. All right, so we are going to open it up. The first question that we have is for all of our panelists, and we'll start with Diana for this first one. So the question is, what is the impact on clients, staff, and the community of having more practitioners on staff that are representative of them within organizations providing behavioral health services?
Okay. Well, there are some nuances between clients, staff, and communities, but overall, I would say there's a few important points around that. One, it creates more cultural connections when people feel like someone might be more understanding of their culture, which may not be the mainstream one. It's a visual representation of hope of overcoming a lot of barriers. When people see that person looks like they might have my skin tone or my hair, and they've seemingly overcome a lot of things to be here. So there's hope for me. When you've been more of a victim of implicit bias, you're less likely to also offend others with it. So overall, it reduces implicit bias. And then when you come from communities where there might be stigma around mental health, it might create some cognitive dissonance in a good way to see, well, that person looks like they belong from my community, but they're working in a place that tries to address things that I might historically have been asked to stay quiet about or not speak about. So those would be some of the points that I would say makes representation important.
Great, thanks, Diana. Tiffany, what about you? What are your thoughts on the question?
I think that to add on to Diana's comment about stigma, I think it helps the individuals who are seeking services to come to an understanding that while they may have experienced some stigma within their own cultures, that there are people who have gone through things that they have gone through and can be more culturally understanding of where they are in their lives and in their circumstances or whatever their needs are. And so having someone who looks like you and is a representative of you is definitely helpful within those things. I think trying to overcome just the barriers that different cultural communities have. But when you see someone who is like you, you're more likely to have feelings expressing that they understand you, and you're more willing to want to participate with someone who you feel will understand you and what your needs are.
Great, thank you. And Dominique?
Thank you. it's hard to follow everyone because it's like, well, what do I say that they haven't already said? But echoing what they said and adding to that, rapport building, regardless of treatment modality, is the foundation of service. And so when you are able to connect with someone, I have individuals who have expressed to me specifically like the sigh of relief when they can relate or they feel like there's some language that they don't have to explain or some experiences that are often understood and don't have to be directly stated. Again, it enables that rapport process to be accelerated, and individuals are able to connect with those that are the treatment providers. It increases the level of comfort and communication.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's really helpful. And so I think as we move into the discussion, we're going to be talking about sort of 3 different aspects of the workforce. So the first part is entry, and how people end up pursuing a degree in, counseling or in social work. And so we'll talk first about what are barriers in the education system that disproportionately impact or exclude people of color as they may be considering careers in helping professions. And I'll start with you, Tiffany.
So I got a lot on this topic, a lot, but not a lot. So I will try to be brief because I want to make sure I have leave room for my co-panelists. But I think I want to start with talking about just racism as an overarching thing, but not necessarily the big scope of racism. But when we look at institutional and structural racism, I had a friend explain in one of our conversations that it's kind of like an old house. The house was built for a certain thing. And then as time went on, the house started to be repurposed and it needed new things added to it, new piping, new fitting, new painting, all of the things that could make that house better to be more accessible and easily accessed by other people. But the problem is it's still an old house. And instead of tearing the house down and building a fresh house that could assist everyone, it just added on different things that may not necessarily still be the right fitting. So the plumbing in that old new house may not necessarily run the way it's supposed to run. And it's not necessarily easy for people of color to access all of these new things that have been put in this house that were supposed to help, but in reality, the house is still old. So if we don't change that institution as a whole, adding on to it doesn't necessarily fix it. Sometimes you have to take that fix all the way down to the foundation. And that is one point. And then another point I wanted to bring out was about policies and how just in some policies on the federal level where there are instances where we have HBCUs, and HBCUs, historically Black colleges, are just that, historically Black. And so there is no more funding for a HBCU to become a HBCU. So there is no way for a school to then take on that moniker of HBCU. However, there is funding for Asian Americans to have funding for schools and Latinx to have funding for schools. And so what that ultimately does is, on a federal level, have institutions vying for these different dollars, but essentially pitting all of these different people of color and cultures into competition against each other for these funds, instead of focusing on how we can have funds for all. Now we have everybody vying and essentially fighting for their piece of the dollar when it's not even enough for everybody. So we're not focused on how to make this a big piece of dollar for everybody, but now we just fighting for the one little dollar in scrap that we're given. And I think that takes the attention off of what the greater need is that all people of color need this funding for their education in their schools. But in fact, we're not focused on that. Now we're just infighting as people of color to get our little piece of the pie, if you will. So I think I'm gonna leave it there and I'll see what everybody else wants to add on and we can continue this discussion.
Thank you, Tiffany. I love the metaphor and really your points to the institutional piece and how it can set up conditions that are not conducive to helping people of color get the education that they're looking for and supporting them through that process. Diana, I'll go to you next on this question.
So Tiffany's point, we could do a whole panel just on this question. So I'll summarize it this way. When it comes to the education system, think of the three phases: input, throughput, output. So the problems are in the input process, who gets accepted into which programs, and the discrepancies in those qualities, and what Tiffany is referring to around the racism and the having BIPOC folks compete with each other for scraps is part of the problem with the input process. It's why we can't get in the door. Then in the throughput process, if we struggle, if we're not keeping up with our white peers, there's no real efforts to understand it through an equity lens. It's often it becomes a personalized, you maybe can't keep up with the program, or maybe your lifestyle right now is not conducive to it, or you're not smart enough, or whatever thing is being said that puts it on you instead of the system to change. And then, Bessie made the point about the output process. And then, if we get through it, look at how much debt we're all carrying to have been able to do something that really is a lot of us ends up being a public service that we should have gotten paid to do instead of having to pay to do it. So I'll just say those points about this.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick follow-up, we facilitated a workforce development networking event with mental health providers and colleges and universities to develop pathways around talking about what the need is for mental health practitioners and how to help connect. And one of the themes that came up was the topic of unpaid internships. And so for many clinical degrees, there's the expectation for students to engage in a full-time unpaid internship as their second year in program, or in some social work programs both years. And so wanted to put that out there as another potential barrier, or there's a lot of conversation around how to develop more paid internship options for students. And not sure if anyone wanted to speak on that within your organizations and internship programs. Or could move on.
No, I can speak to my own experience. I mean, I feel like as it pertains to internships, just in hiring interns, when you have to try to figure out, most students are of a certain age. People of color are of a certain age when they are trying to get internships and they have a full-time job. And so I often struggled with placing interns and students in a what could have been a traditional 9-to-5. So they had an expectation of what they wanted their internship experience to be. That may have included individual therapy, it may have included groups, but because they had a 9-to-5, there were no afternoon or there's no evening internship hours unless you were in a hospital setting. But then your supervision is limited unless you were in a crisis setting. And again, your supervision is limited because most supervisors work 9-to-5 and not 3 to 11. And so when you're looking at trying to find internships that are off hours and then quality supervision, it becomes very discouraging. And I had students that were just like felt defeated because they weren't able to figure out how to balance their families, their work, and then still finish their education. And this may have been, for some students, this may have been their third, fourth, fifth attempt at trying to finish college and getting that degree. And this is the barrier, that they just can't get hours that they need in order just to get their internship done. And so you do at that point lose people in that point of the process because they can't figure out how to just make life work.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll quickly add around that is the systemic issue where internships are set up for folks in their early 20s who have the financial means to attend school full-time. That's the way the system is set up. And so by and large, the folks who don't meet that demographic are BIPOC folks.
Anything to add, Dominique? I think you're going to say something.
I was trying to get off mute for a long time. Thank you for unmuting me. I'm skipping a little bit ahead to retention, but I think in terms of offering internships and building capacity in the field in what we would consider off hours is going to be a really important piece for what we would consider non-traditional students. Mm-hmm. And so I know that there's often, having worked in field education, there's often a huge challenge with finding internships for individuals who work full-time jobs or who have families. And so I think when we think about hiring and retention and building a pipeline for individuals to be able to enter into this field, we have to take those things into consideration.
Great points. Thank you so much. So you mentioned hiring, and so kind of the internship process is moving towards entering the workforce. And so the next cluster of questions we'll be talking about is around hiring. And Dominique, I'm going to pass this question to you first. What strategies have you tried to diversify your mental health practitioners on staff, and how have they worked?
So I think this question is twofold, both internal and external. When I think about external strategies, it's about visibility. We started off talking about representation. And so for me, it's very personal and making sure that when I am that I'm participating actively in the hiring process. So I work with HR to visit universities, to participate in lunch and learns. Well, in this era, Zoom, but we're doing lunch and learns via Zoom and other things where people know, who's running the program, what opportunities are available, and that there are opportunities, for a diverse group of individuals to do the work that we do. So externally, I also keep in touch with colleagues so that they know in the university setting what we're doing, who we are, and that the jobs that are available, advocacy externally to funders in terms of funding positions at a certain level is really important. I participate, in those meetings when funders are coming out and saying, how are things going and what do you need? And I think that's an important part of the external hiring process to make sure that we have, the internal resources to be able to support individuals. And I think in terms of internally, it's about capacity building and making sure that we have attractive benefits, including supervision to individuals who are joining our teams. And so when we're hiring, I'm clear about what we offer as an organization to individuals who are interested in growth.
Great, thank you so much.
Kathy, if you don't mind, I want to jump in. I want to add something to the conversation about funders. And, I just want to delineate how organizations can be funded and then kind of go around about with that. But, a lot of organizations, community mental health organizations, are funded by grants, and they're also funded like fee for service. And so depending on the organization and how they're funding, or depending on the program and how it's funded, that conversation that Dominique is having about funding positions at an equitable rate is very important. So you may have some programs that are completely grant-based, and you can have that budgetary conversation about funding a position at the rate it's supposed to be. But there are other organizations that within that same organization may have certain programs that are funded only by fee for service, and those are being paid strictly off of Medicaid billing, so or insurance provided billing. And in those instances, that type of funding is not necessarily sustainable for equitable salaries. So you're looking at, which organizations or which groups of organizations can bill at a higher rate, meaning they're billing far more, they're seeing far more clients, their caseload is far greater than it should be, in an effort to make enough in billing in order to pay salaries at a more equitable rate. But if I'm seeing so many clients, and this is going to lean into retention, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, but if my caseload is so great, in order for me to make the money that I need to make to sustain my living, is it worth it? And so when we talk about retention, and you have an overworked clinician trying to just make enough in billable hours to provide these services, you will struggle with retention, because you shouldn't have to fight as hard in paying, because Medicaid rates are paid at such a low rate, versus a grant that can be funded to pay a specific position at an equitable rate. And so I want to make sure that there's an understanding that a lot of people of color have Medicaid, and that particular rate is not as good as someone who has insurance, who has health insurance through their company, through their job. So those rates that are being paid out differently also contribute to retention in your workforce staff. It also contributes to staff turnover and things of that nature. So I don't want to leave that out of the discussion in, again, hiring, because if I'm a hiring manager and I tell a candidate, oh, you have to bill 40 hours a week, but you have a 40-hour work week, then your question to me is going to be, well, when do I get a lunch? When do I do documentation? All of these things that go into this work that you can't realistically do in a 40-hour work week just in order to make the salary that's going to pay you what you need to make. So I just wanted to add that point about funding and how positions are funded and paid for and how salaries are paid for.
Mm-hmm. And kind of the funding mechanisms of organizations. Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. So, and we've been seeing, you know, the SAMHSA Behavioral Health Equity Report demonstrated some concerning data around Black and Latinx teenagers, adolescents 12 to 17, are engaging in treatment for depression at lower rates than white teenagers. And so, you know, the data, specific data is 35 to 37% respectively to 50% of white teenagers. And so why do you think it is that young people of color are among the most high needs populations when it comes to mental health, and yet some show some of the lowest rates of utilization of mental health care? And Dominique, I'll start with you.
So you have generations of trauma, poverty, and current lack of investment. And then you tell this kid who is experiencing that to go to therapy and or participate in mental health services, and the way in which they traditionally view someone who's helping is not really help. Typically, it's they associate mental health professionals with school social workers or DCFS, and that's not something that's looked at in a favorable light. And so being able to help someone who's had examples, generational examples of mental health professionals that aren't so positive, say, this person is going to help you, coupled with the person, when we talk about representation, and that person doesn't necessarily look like them or have that experience, it does point to lack of engagement and some amount of hesitancy around receiving mental health services. You have a historical point of view and a current lack of, they don't see people who look like us. They don't see people who are mental health professionals who are approaching assistance from a proactive, standpoint. Traditionally, it is, if I tell people I'm a social worker, they say, do you work for DCFS? Are you a school social worker? So generally speaking, mental health, I think from a community standpoint, mental health assistants and individuals fall into a certain category that carries a lot of stigma that keeps individuals from engaging. And access, right? So, you don't have a lot of those services available that are proactive or that are helpful. So they don't have the opportunity to engage in them because they aren't available as much.
Thank you so much.
Add, sorry, Kathy.
Go ahead.
Just wanted to briefly add that mental health treatment inherently involves vulnerability, and people often know that, and vulnerability is a privilege. Not a thing that everyone can walk around with. So everything that Dominique just described that these Black and Latinx youth are walking around with, they're not going to walk into a situation and sign up to be vulnerable and sign up to put themselves at risk in a lot of ways. And it's completely normal that they view us as threatening for a long time until they can see other signs that we're not, and goes back to why representation matters, because that is something right away that can help with some of that mistrust and that discrepancy between who can feel more comfortable being vulnerable and who can't.
Yep. And I think I'd like to add, especially when we're looking within our own city and how siloed mental health services are. I mean, as a person who, as a parent, who will then have to try to navigate mental health services for their child, you first of all have a child who is in some sort of mental health crisis, and you honestly don't know where to turn. So your first choice will probably be, to Dominique's point, your school social worker. Well, the school social worker is the social worker for the entire school, is one person, and they may be the social worker for a couple of schools. So they may not necessarily have the attention span and understanding of the resources that may be available. And so if you don't even know how to enter into the system of receiving mental health services, you're very much unlikely to get services or treatment for your child. You may start at the pediatrician, and a pediatrician, for may send you to directly to the hospital they're affiliated with. And that hospital will then tell you, oh, we don't have that type of service here for children. You may want to reach out to your insurance provider to see who they can help you with. But if you are someone who has Medicaid, then that's virtually impossible to go into a website. You may not even have access to this website. You may not even be fully English speaking. So accessing all of these services can be very much overwhelming. And not knowing that it could be something as simple as, and this is a shameless plug, going to the City of Chicago website, and City of Chicago has 5 clinics. And so there may be a clinic that can offer free services to you and your family, but you would not even know to do that. And so I think as far as access is concerned, we have to look at better ways as clinicians as to how we as a whole, or a system as a whole, advertise to our communities of color, so that they can figure out or have a better understanding of how to even access the system in and of itself to get the help that they need.
Thank you, Tiffany. That I think you spoke to barriers, that exist for young people of color to get into services. And I think that's a lot of the work we're doing, is to try to bring big systems on a city level, to help with that process. And this question is for the whole panel as well. How do you feel racial inequities such as microaggressions, stigma, show up in mental health settings, especially for young people of color? Does anyone have thoughts?
Repeat the question one more time for us. My volume went out.
Okay. How do you feel racial inequities such as microaggressions, stigma, et cetera, show up in mental health settings, and especially for young people of color?
Well, I think they show up like when you walk in the door. We keep coming back to this issue of representation, right? They show up at the point of contact and integration into the services, a lack of awareness of who the young person is and the experiences that they've had. And I like not to call that a microaggression, because I think that speaks loud and clear of you understanding and being trauma informed and meeting the individual where they are. So the point of access, when individuals can't relate or understand or make assumptions about who the individual, who the client or child is, creates the first and initial distrust of the system and or services that they're getting ready to be offered.
Yeah, and I think that there just really isn't, in this instance, a place for microaggressions when we're talking about mental illness. Mental illness doesn't necessarily see race. It doesn't see socioeconomic status. It doesn't see gender or gender identity. It doesn't see any of those things. It's in illness. It's a thing all its own that requires its own special treatment. If we were talking about an individual with diabetes, or we were talking about, another medical need or medical necessity, even if we were talking about substance use, those things have their own set of access points that are very much widely known on how to access and how to get to. Stigma aside, microaggression aside, but it's something specific about mental illness with people of color that requires us to be, a little more focused when we want to try to make sure that we are limiting anything that's negative, that will negatively impact access to it.
And I would say the other way it shows up is that one of the inherent things that needs to be present in therapy and a therapist when you're sitting with a client is curiosity. You need to be curious about who they are and their world, and young people of color get that taken away a lot quicker because gaps are filled in by what they see in the media or by implicit biases or assumptions being made about them. So there's less need of a curiosity because maybe you think you can fill in the blanks with X, Y, and Z thing that you saw on whatever X TV show, perhaps.
Thank you. So now we're going to move more towards retention, which we've mentioned it a few times already. So the first question is for the whole panel. We'll start with Diana. What issues related to retention of people of color practitioners had you noticed prior to the pandemic, and how have these been exacerbated by the pandemic?
we've mentioned already so many without getting to this question yet. So I guess I'll just kind of either reiterate some or mention new ones briefly, but this is again beyond just about the money, but the lack of intergenerational wealth is important because you're less able to stick out certain situations if you don't have a parent or grandparent or so and so you can rely on for as a fallback if something is happening financially and you're not making enough money. At the initial part of the pandemic, a lot of organizations were going through tough uncertainty about what's going to happen financially. So I think it was made worse by that, where people had to make decisions for their own financial stability to seek employment in either a more stable organization or maybe just a different arena altogether where you didn't have to face this kind of instability all the time. The other things that I'll say is just as inherently BIPOC folks tend to already come with more, for example, experience of racial trauma. Now you're sitting there and you're treating folks with racial trauma. And so that experience is just different, where maybe one day you don't, it gets too much, especially if you don't have your own support or your own access to a support system in the same way. So that's kind of an issue where at some point it just feels like too much. And then, Tiffany talked about this a little bit with kind of the service time requirements, depending on the kind of organization, but just kind of a general feeling of being perpetually underappreciated and undervalued, and kind of the numbers mattering more than the work, or kind of not being seen for the work that you're doing if the numbers aren't matching up. I would say.
Thanks, Diana. Dominique or Tiffany, want to jump
Sure.
in?
I think similar to what Diana shared, I think often organizations forget that our clinicians are human beings just like those that we're servicing. And the experience of vicarious trauma in the delivery of services is very real. And so I think the lack of responsive supervision really does contribute to retention. You want to know that those that you work for support you and understand who you are as a person in your experience of treating the young person or treating the client. So I would put some of that onus on the organization in terms of providing, you have a clinician who has a high caseload, again, their own unaddressed trauma, and they're working through someone else's trauma. So I think that really does contribute to retention and individuals feeling heard and understood and being able to work through their experience in the work.
I think I would add, as far as retention, I think pre-pandemic, a lot of organizations were able to do community-based services, meaning that their staff was going out into the community to meet the clients where they were. So that would mean in-home therapy, case management, things of that nature. But during the pandemic, all of those things had to cease, and clinicians had to pivot. Case management started to look very different. It was something that could be done from your computer versus from actually being out with the community, or a person in the community. And so I feel like some of those pivots demonstrated that some things weren't always necessary. So you didn't necessarily need to go out into the community with the client to work with some people on skill building. These are things that you may have been able to do via Zoom. I worked with some very skilled occupational therapists that were able to ship things to their clients and then via Zoom train their clients over a Zoom link. And it was very cool to see them pivot in that way. And I think that taught us that we didn't necessarily need to actually go out, but that also inhibited us in a way that some people then became more comfortable with not going out. And you had social isolation from the clients as well as the staff. And so those things exacerbate that, and that is in ways in which the pandemic exacerbated the workforce, because once clinicians were asked to come back in the office to do the work, and they had demonstrated that they could do the work without coming in the office, well, then why do I need to come in the office? And then the pivot of maybe I need a different job. Maybe I need a different career altogether, because there are other ways to do this. And we expected people to come back and function under a model that may now have proven itself to be a bit antiquated. And we haven't caught up with how to grow this model to fit the current times.
Thanks, Tiffany. And so you're mentioning return to workforce. And so, recent reporting from NBC's Curtis Bunn, we know that only 3% of Black professional workers are ready to return to the office after having spent the last year and a half avoiding racism, crude jokes, and office politics. And so how do you think the anticipation of returning to a hostile work environment is being considered by workplaces as efforts are being made for a return to in-person work and for operating with a racial equity lens internally? And Diana, I can lock that to you.
If workplaces want to make progress in racial equity, so BIPOC folks will feel more comfortable returning to the office, then they are focusing on making some major internal shifts away from not just the business side of things, but also a greater morality, a greater sense of responsibility for the people who work for you and understanding their experiences and why folks may not want to come back to work. It's like, yes, this narrative gets developed about all the conveniences or God forbid that people are lazy, things like that. But organizations with a racial equity lens are considering how things like microaggressions impact folks wanting to be in the office and be around people. And so the first place that this has to start has to be with genuine conversations about the transgressions that have been committed in the past and how to address that and make up for that and do better in the future. No one is asking for perfection, but for understanding of basic things. Your intention versus your impact are two very different things. And genuine conversations, no matter how difficult they are always better than the disingenuous conversations that occur when people pretend or perform to cater to folks that see right through what they're doing anyway.
I think to add to what Diana is saying, I think whether you're returning to the office or you're having a hybrid model or 100% virtual model, those are absolutely necessary conversations. Those things are still going to occur. They don't go away because we're hybrid or because we're 100% virtual. But that willingness to engage in that conversation has to be at the forefront and in the dialogue with work at the organizational level.
Thank you so much. So the next question, how has retention of BIPOC staff been impacted by the recent increase in performative activism as well as racism in the workplace? And this can start with Diana or Dominique, either one.
Go ahead, Dominique.
I'm going to defer to you, Diana. So I'm on the spot here. I think it puts us all on edge, right? We talk about just a person's responsiveness and what is going on in society, and society is still the workplace, right? Society is still the workplace. And so we take what we feel and what we're experiencing, as individuals to work with us. And, I think when tensions are high, individuals are choosing themselves and saying that's something that they don't necessarily have to deal with. There's also something we have not talked about, which I think is even increasing among clinicians of color, is going into private practice and retreating from engaging in organizational dynamics because it's just too much. So I think it's an important conversation that needs to be a part of the dialogue in terms of options that people have when things are going on in the world and what they want to choose for themselves.
Yeah. So how it impacts retention is this: performative activism and racism in workplaces makes it easier for people of color to quit. That is how it impacts retention. Because as I mentioned before, performative activism is easy to spot. People are not being clever. It is not subtle. It is easy to spot, and it makes it easier for folks to quit when they realize that people say one thing and then don't behave in accordance with that. And so it's not a good thing to be, I'll state the obvious, it's not a good thing to be racist, and it's not a good thing to do activism just for performative reasons.
Thank you. Tiffany, any last thoughts before I move to the next question?
Nope, I think they knocked that one out.
Yeah. Okay, so this last question is for, the full panel. So what can we, as graduate programs, philanthropy, government stakeholders, and other behavioral health providers do in order for there to be a greater representation amongst mental health practitioners? And I will defer to you all, to who wants to get started.
I think we start, there are so many levels, there are levels to this, as they say, activism on the federal and state level as far as education and how to turn those federal dollars into actionable dollars where you see a real change amongst the BIPOC population in the education system. I think it can start there. I think at a certain point, it could start all the way back in elementary school on that career day where you actually start talking about careers in this field. I think, we glamorize, firemen and police and nurses and, there's so many things. I can tell you from my own experience, I didn't think I was going to be a social worker growing up. I didn't know what that was. I was going to be a nurse. And here I am, a social worker, not nursing, and even tried to go to nursing school. Wasn't for me. This has always been my calling, but helping youth to honestly see this as a viable direction to go in, because there are people who want to help and want to be in the helping field, but they only see certain pathways. So actually illuminating this as a pathway for youth of color, then we can start there. I think take it all the way back to the career, to the womb, if you will.
Thanks, Tiffany.
What I would say is that whether you named a couple different sectors, graduate programs, philanthropy, wherever you are, it moves beyond the conversation. You have to show up. I have a really long calendar, but being here today was important to have a conversation, but also it's what I do every day on a daily basis. So whatever your sector is, how do you show up and contribute actively to those conversations? How do you show up and provide opportunities for individuals? I think each individual has to take a look at themselves and figure out, how do you move beyond the conversation to practice? What does it look like to put these things into practice and to do them like it's a daily practice? It's not something that we can have a conversation for or about and put down. You have to think of ways that you can consistently engage in providing actionable solutions.
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of Dominique as well, that I think it's important to model for other BIPOC folks the importance of speaking the truth, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. I think folks need to know that the truths are needed, because conversations and solutions we're not going to come up with them if we don't even have the data in the first place to say, this is what's happening and this is my experience. So modeling that, and then I think something that we've touched on that I think is important is mentorship opportunities and being available as a mentor when there's not that many, let's say, as an example, like Black or Latinx women in leadership. If there's not that many, then those of us that are to avail ourselves to those that are interested and may want to also be a leader in the future. What can we do in terms of mentorship to make it seem more attainable than it has been historically?
Thank you so much, everyone. You have been amazing. I appreciate your authenticity and these questions and this conversation. I really appreciate the work you do every day. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we move to the next questions?
I think for me, I just want to say thank you to our alternatives for getting this conversation started. Um, um, it was definitely not something that I expected, but to be able to have the conversation before the conversation, I think in terms of our prep for this was equally as important to me, to be able to have the conversation with like-minded individuals and people who look similar to me. So I just want to, say that and thank Alternatives for hosting this panel.
I'd have to echo that sentiment. I think we as clinicians, we have our we have our circle of clinicians that we came through school with, we've worked with, we have our clinical village, if you will. And within that, we have these conversations, but they are like at home around, dinner and, on the phone, but we aren't highlighting them in such a grand way. And I think having more conversations that are bigger, that are open, that, the world can participate in besides just us in our little silos is something that is very much needed and useful. And so to echo Dominique, I am quite thankful that this panel has presented itself for us.
Yeah, same. They stole the words. Just very much thank you to Alternatives and Kathy and Bessie for their participation as well. And I think I just want to give the closing thought that we had talked a little bit about this in the meeting that we had, but how terrible it is to kind of have to beg for the bare minimum that we're trying to get our folks here. It's like the right to mental health, which everyone should have, and how terrible it is to like do a song and a dance, whether it's fee for service or grant requirements, to have to struggle so much for it. But these conversations are important, and they move the needle, and they take away white supremacy's ability to convince us that we have to fight each other for scraps. If we work together and we have these conversations, that's when we're going to be able to make more progress and gaining access to the things that everyone should have a right to. So, thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. An Alternatives team, I don't know, Bessie, if you'd like to jump back on.
Apparently I'm back on. I got unmuted. I was like, wait, where are we? So I want to thank all of you for participating today. You couldn't see me, but I was nodding along with so much of what all of you were saying. It was, you guys hit so many of the major points. So again, thank you. One of the things, that in listening, I wanted to ask you all these other questions to just really hone in on certain points. And you can only, like you guys said, we could have done a panel on any one of these questions by themselves, right? So I think that was a little bit of a challenge. And I think all of you handled it beautifully. I want to kind of just talk a little bit about, like, at Alternatives, some of what we're doing around racial equity and retention, because this is a hot topic for us, given that, this is why we're hosting the panel around it. And I think for us, one of the things that we're obviously looking at pay and what our thought around a livable wage is. We rolled one out last year, but with the cost of living increasing as much as it has this year, and we've talked quite a bit about that, there's challenges with it. One of the things I really appreciate that you brought up was just the funding portion of it, right? We've been talking about this internally, like, we love the funders that give us money year over year. And also it's been, say, 50K for the last 8 years, right? And so 50K 8 years ago went a lot further than it does today. And so, like, the challenges that come with keeping up with our staff and retention just for pay with all this debt and things that they've taken on. And so one of the things that we've done is we rolled out a pretty heavy racial equity plan that has public accountability. So it's an internal document for us that everybody has access to, so they can hold leadership accountable to. We've done a lot of work around representation at all levels. I think some of you brought up how important it is, Dominique, when recruiting for people to see people that look like them at the leadership positions and things like that. Our board is majority of color. And we're looking at benefits a little bit differently, and what other benefits we can roll out that contribute to closing wealth gaps for our staff of color. And so we're actually going to be rolling out a public document soon about some of the things that we've done and for other people to have access to, because we're trying to move away from this conversation about race and retention from simply being a statement and a couple of trainings, right? Like, that's what when we ask the question about performative activism, that's what we've seen a lot. Companies release a statement and they have a couple of anti-racist workshops with their staff, and that's pretty much the end of it. And so really kind of thinking about how to embed it in the structure has been a question that we've been asking ourselves a lot. And so, shameless plug, Tiffany, I think you did one earlier. I'm going to do mine right now. Sign up for our newsletter if you want to see when that rolls out and learn a little bit more about us. I think with that, it is now we're turning it over for the Q&A for anybody who's attended, if they have any questions for alternatives or the panelists. Questions? We got all the answers during our panel.
Were there any questions in the chat?
I don't see any.
This is an awesome opportunity to hear from some wonderful people. So please take advantage, those of you who are participating.
Feel free to message me if you have any questions. Okay, we have a question from Molly. Molly says, I'm thinking about the comment on mentorship and wondering if there are any existing affinity groups for mental health practitioners here in Chicago, for BIPOC people specifically.
I think the fact that we are wrecking our brains trying to figure out what we know should signify that I don't think we know of any. And I think that's the bigger issue, that perhaps this is something that we can maybe put down in pen to try to figure out how to make this a bigger thing. Different organizations may have their roundtables, but as an individual entity, that may be something that is going to be difficult. I honestly don't know. There are different groups around licensure and help with licensing, but to just have mentorship, I think typically what we've done, and I can speak to my own self, is just I've taken on younger clinicians that I've worked with or that I may have worked with when they were students, and I've still been offering mentorship to them. But to say as an organization, or if there is a specific group that's out there in the city, I personally can't think of it off the top of my head. No, I don't know.
I think there's the, what did I'm sorry, the association, I was looking in my email because I get an email, the Chicago Association of Black Psychologists. There may be some opportunities. I tend to get emails, from them. And I got distracted because there was a question with my name on it in the chat simultaneously. But I'm personally not a part of any groups, as Tiffany kind of said earlier. I connect with people individually and as a group on a regular basis who are doing similar work pretty much quarterly. And also recently I've gotten an increase from individuals who I've either taught and or who intern for me asking for requests for mentorship. So when those opportunities are presented to me personally, I usually don't say no, and find the time to support them, because I think that's an important aspect of growing capacity in our field.
Yeah, same. Kind of like I could only think of like personal networks or internal organizational things, but not a citywide effort. And my thought was someone should create one. That sounds like a great idea.
Another question in the chat from Amy, who asks, can you quantify how many more mental health staff we need in the public Illinois children's mental health system? Figuring out the metrics to help us measure progress seems critical and complicated.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, of course. So she's asking if we can quantify how many more mental health staff we need in public Illinois children's mental health system. Yeah.
I think that's a difficult one to field because children in mental health is its own niche. And I think as far as the state is concerned, you're looking at, different types of access points. So you may have clinicians who are working with children who are in foster care. That's its own niche. To Dominique's point earlier, you may have clinicians who are working with children in the school setting. That's its own niche. And I know school social work is, there are a lot of vacancies in school social work. It's just a matter of can the city and these different municipalities afford the social workers? That's usually the issue at hand. And then when you're looking at other levels, whether it's private practice or community-based, that's a big number. It's a real big number.
We have another question in the chat. Any ideas about the shortage of men in the field, impact or solutions?
We were talking about that in our pre setup for this panel, and we discussed, and I brought the point that it was interesting that this is a female dominated field, and that to know a clinician that's licensed, a male clinician that's licensed, we probably know the same 3 people, because it's very difficult when we're talking about male clinicians of color in the field. They do exist, but it may be that they are coming into this particular arena of work. They may be in the arena of work where they may be in jails, or they may be working with those people who are coming out of jail or prison, and within parole or probation. So they may be in an area of the field that may be more suited for them versus being in a different type of community setting. So they do exist. They do exist, but it is definitely difficult. And again, this work isn't glamorous sometimes. So, I'll kick it off to Diana and Dominique for their take on it.
I think also as a part of this conversation that we're not having is that the few men that we have rise to the level of administration quicker sometimes.
Yes.
Sometimes than we do. And so they don't often stay at the direct practice level, the few of them that are, in our midst. So I think that's probably a pretty known and statistical fact.
Yeah, I think on a direct service level, why we don't have more, let's say, particularly BIPOC men as therapists working directly with, let's say, kids, is a lot of complex things, especially around gender dynamics and toxic masculinity and access and all sorts of things. That's a different panel. But I was having the same thought as Dominique, which is it's harder for that issue to stay forefront for me, because we are like most fields where even if it's female dominated, the higher up you go, the less likely you are to see females anyway. So that issue stays less in the forefront of my mind often for that reason, because that equity issue in leadership, there's still a huge discrepancy. We are like most fields in that way.
Next question is, how do we begin changing the mental health educational system to be more flexible for students who work full-time, and what would that look like in an ideal world?
I can't even begin to explain how big that question is. So I'll name a couple of things. I think one big thing is that if you are working in the field, that should count towards your internship, in my opinion. And because a lot of people, especially what higher education refers to as non-traditional students, which is typically people of color because we're older when we go back to grad school, a a lot of us already have, I know I already had a job. And so being able to count that would go a long way. And in my opinion, it's comparable because if you have somebody who's going straight through school, they've never worked before. And so why should I, if I already work, why should I have to get an additional internship over that? I think another piece that stands out is that there's this assumption, because this is a caring profession, people already know how to interact with diverse populations, and that assumption is not true. I experienced some horrible racism in the classroom at my graduate school, and that made me not want to attend specific classes. The teachers were not equipped to deal with students of color. And this got brought up in a panel. And so there needs to be a complete just training and screening of the professors in there. I think also just the entire curriculum around social work, in my experience, was there was classes around diversity were always taught from a white-centered point of view. And so you were taught how to work with Latinx populations. You were taught how to work with Black populations and Muslim populations. And so if you're a person of color, you're not taught how to work with white people. There was an assumption that we already knew how to work with white people, right? So the curriculum itself is actually racist. And so, and then there's the amount of debt that comes with attending graduate school. Most of the, you have a certain amount of credentials and internships you have to take. And so there should be the public service, and this is on higher ed and on the feds, the public service loan program, the forgiveness program does not go far enough. And so those are the things that kind of jump to my mind immediately.
To follow that question, unless anyone has anything else too.
I think I was going to say something to Bessie's point around instructors and what that looks like. And having taught at a couple different universities, it goes back to like what we're being paid. And, for me, it was more, I wanted to be there and I wanted to make that contribution. It wasn't that it added, it didn't reduce my debt by a lot, if that makes sense. And so that commitment to coming full circle and being part of the solution that I saw as a problem was really important to me. And so when I had those opportunities to be an adjunct instructor, I took advantage of those so that students could see people like me teaching courses and showing up and representing that way.
Next question is from Sarah, who said, tempted to pose the miracle question. What are some things that would be featured in your dream landscape of mental health services?
I've certainly spent time talking with colleagues about my dream scenario, so I can speak to aspects of it. The importance of the parallel process, that the same thing we know and instinctively give to clients, we also know and instinctively give to staff and therapists. I would love to see every organization bend over backwards to make sure every BIPOC person has the best quality therapists available to them of their choice, regardless of pay or finances or insurance. I would love to see, as I mentioned, mentorship opportunities for everyone who wants them. And I would love to see efforts to close some of the gaps that exist, for example, educational ones. If I didn't get as quality of an education as someone else did, and so my writing skills aren't the same as my peers and white bodies who had the best education their whole life, then what can be done to close that gap, instead of kind of putting us in positions where you're perpetuating the narrative, I'm not as good of a worker or not as hard of a worker, or don't get the things as much, like to give staff the resources that, for the most part, if you are a well-intentioned clinician, regardless of race, you would know and want for your client. The same thing needs to be happening for BIPOC staff as well. The resources need to be put towards them.
Someone earlier mentioned that, Sean, I think it was Diana, and she said that vulnerability was a privilege. And so that resonated with me. And when I think about that and connect that to what's ideal for me, I think the ability for individuals who seek services and those that provide them to show up authentically. And the systems that could create those opportunities to recognize the importance of that and to be able to fund that adequately.
I don't know if Tiffany wants to go before I jump in, because I'm going to wrap things up too. Okay, I'm guessing she's on. It's funny, this is such a big question, again, that I appreciate. I think, so there's a couple of things here. I would love to see a reframing of mental health in general. And I talked a little bit about this at a different panel, where mental health is really more of a community health issue, and it's a issue of poverty and access and low education, et cetera. Because if somebody is experiencing, if they're living in a community because their parents can't work, right? At jobs that are paying a livable wage, and they're experiencing violence and they have low access to education, you can't therapy a person out of that situation. And so often as nonprofits, we're charged with being able to say things like, in a year, I got this award last year, and this year I have to report on outcomes. Here's the significant change I've made with this person who is still experiencing community violence, and I have to show an improvement on their mental health to get my dollars for next year. The community violence hasn't gone away. And all we're doing is talk therapy once a week, right? And so there is this, the expectations are too big for what we're actually tasked to do and the resources that we're given. And so just really reframing this issue, I think, would be huge. And that would reframe the expectations and what you're asking of us as practitioners to be able to deliver. And with that being said, especially now more than ever, there's this huge understanding that we need people of color in these positions, but the resources aren't going along with it. And one of the things I often talk about is that there was this article I read a while back that talked about nonprofits now being the third largest sector in the US, but also being one with the lowest wages. And so this is a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, where we're hiring people. If we're hiring people, our entry-level jobs are at $35,000 a year. We're actually contributing to the poverty that we're supposed to be eradicating, right? And we can't do better because we are, Diana, you said this during our prep session, right? We're literally spending our time begging for scraps to show that we're worthy of this money, right? And so a reframing of how the funding process is done, how we talk about our services, being able to work in partnership, understanding what our philanthropy, understanding what equity looks like from our perspective, that's beyond representation and dollars in the same way that we've always done it. And really just being able to deliver the quality of services that we know need to happen, but we know can't happen at this point. And so that would be the dream. Before I wrap up, Tiffany, did you want to add anything?
No, and I want to apologize. I actually had a client-related crisis that's going on right now, so I'm attending to it and this at the same time, such as this field where, we do this work while we're doing this work. So
yeah, indicative of what we do, right? Perfect example in real time.
Yes.
Again, and thank you again, everybody, for showing up. I know everybody has a busy schedule, and this is a lot for us to talk about too, the emotional labor that it takes to talk about issues that, as we're talking about delivering services, also impact us as individuals. I don't know that can be described, but I do appreciate the time and everybody else who came here to listen to us today. Thank you.